Madame Maigret's Admirer by Georges Simenon in the Maigret saga. In the Maigret's household, as in many others, certain traditions had grown up which had eventually become as important to them as are religious rites for some people. Thus, during the many years they had lived in the Place Divo, the superintendent had formed the habit in summer of undoing his dark tie as soon as he came in from the courtyard and started up the staircase, completing the process by the time he reached the first floor. The staircase of the building, which, like all those in the square, had once been a splendid private mansion, ceased at that point to rise majestically between wrought iron banisters and walls of imitation marble. It became steep and narrow, and Maigret, panting a little, reached the second floor with his shirt collar open. He still had to go along a poorly lit corridor as far as his own door, the third on the left, and as he put his key into the lock, carrying his jacket over his arm, he invariably called out, "It's me!" and he would sniff so as to guess from the smell what was cooking for lunch. Then he would make his way into the dining room, whose tall window was open onto the dazzling sight of the square, where 4 fountains were flashing musically. It was June, the weather was particularly hot, and at police headquarters the talk was all of holidays. There were people in their shirt sleeves on the boulevards, and beer was flowing freely on the terrace of every cafe. "Have you seen your admirer?" the superintendent asked, mopping his brow as he settled down by the window. Nobody would have guessed at that moment that he had just spent hours in that sort of anti-crime laboratory known as police headquarters, studying the darkest and most sordid recesses of the human heart. Away from work, he was ready to be amused by trifles, particularly when it was a matter of teasing his naive wife. For the past fortnight, the standing joke had been to ask her for news of her admirer. "Does he still go for his 2 little turns around the square? Is he still just as mysterious and distinguished-looking? When I think that you've a weakness for distinguished-looking men, and yet you married me." Madame Maigret was going back and forth laying the table. Since she would not have a maid, merely a cleaning woman in the mornings for the rough work, she took up the game. "I never said he was distinguished-looking, but you described him to me. A light gray hat with a bound brim, a small turned-up mustache probably dyed, a walking stick with a carved ivory knob. You may laugh, but one of these days you'll realize that I was right. I'm convinced that he's no ordinary man, and that his behavior means there's something strange going on." From the window, one could automatically watch the comings and goings through the Place de Vosges, which was fairly empty in the mornings, but where, in the afternoons, the mothers and nannies of the neighborhood sat on benches watching children at play. All around the public garden, which, fenced in by its railings, is one of the most formal in Paris, stand identical houses with arcades and steeply sloping roofs. To begin with, Madame Maigret had paid only casual attention to the stranger, who could scarcely have passed unnoticed, since everything about his dress and attitude was 20 or 30 years out of date, and he reminded one of the typical old dandy only to be seen nowadays in the illustrations of humorous magazines. It was early in the morning, the time when all the houses had their windows wide open, and one could see maids busy with housework in the various homes. "He seems to be looking out for something," Madame Maigret had commented. That afternoon, she had gone to visit her sister, and next day, at exactly the same time, she had seen the stranger again walking around the square at a steady pace, once, and then twice, and finally disappearing in the direction of the Republic district. "Probably an old fellow who fancies little housemaids, and comes to watch them." Shaking the carpets, Maigret had said when his wife, in the course of conversation, had mentioned her old dandy. And at 3 o'clock that afternoon, to her considerable surprise, she had seen him sitting on a bench immediately opposite her window, motionless, with his hands folded on the knob of his walking stick. At 4 o'clock he was still there. At 5 o'clock he was still there. Not until 6 o'clock did he get up and take himself off along the Rue de Tourelle without having spoken a word to anyone or even unfolded a newspaper. "Don't you think it's odd, Maigret?" For she had always addressed her husband by his surname. "I've already told you, there must certainly have been some pretty servant girls around him." And next day Madame Maigret returned to the attack. "I watched him carefully, for he spent 3 hours again sitting on the same bench in the same place. Perhaps he wanted to have a good look at you. From that bench one must be able to see into our apartment, and the gentleman's in love with you. Don't talk such nonsense. For one thing, he carries a walking stick, and you've always liked men who use walking sticks. I bet he wears pan. Why? Because you've a weakness for men with pan." They were bickering gently after 20 years of marriage, enjoying the pleasant peace of their home. Listen, I looked carefully all around him. There was indeed a nursemaid sitting just opposite him on a chair, a girl I'd already noticed in the fruiter's shop. For one thing, because she's very pretty and, furthermore, because she's distinguished looking. "There you are," said Maigret triumphantly. "Your distinguished-looking maid was sitting in front of the old gentleman. You've already noticed that women sometimes sit down without realizing what they're showing, and your admirer spent the afternoon ogling her. That's all you think about. So long as I haven't seen your mystery man. Can I help it if he only comes when you aren't here?" And Maigret, who was in constant contact with so many sensational happenings, revived his spirits by such simple pleasantries, and never failed to ask for news of the man whom they had come to describe as Madame Maigret's admirer. You can laugh as much as you like. All the same, there's something about him, I don't know what, that fascinates and rather frightens me. I don't know how to explain. When you look at him, you can't take your eyes off him for hours on end. He can sit in the same place without stirring, and even his eyes don't move. Behind his pea, could you see his eyes from here?" Madame Maigret almost blushed as though caught in the act. I went up to have a closer look. I particularly wanted to know if you'd been right. Well, the blonde nursemaid who always has 2 children with her behaves very properly, and there's nothing to be noticed. Does she stop there all afternoon, too? She arrives about 3, usually after the man. She always has some crochet work with her. They leave at roughly the same time. For hours on end, she works at her crochet without raising her head, except sometimes to call back the children if they wander off. Don't you think, darling, that there are hundreds of nursemaids sitting in the public gardens of Paris doing crochet or knitting for hours on end while they look after their employers' children? Quite possibly, and lots of old retired gentlemen who have nothing to do but warm themselves in the sun, casting lustful glances at pretty girls. This one isn't old. You told me yourself that his mustache was certainly dyed, and that he must be wearing a wig. Yes, but he doesn't seem old, the same age as me. Sometimes he seems older, and sometimes younger. And Maigret, pretending to be jealous, grumbled, "One of these days, I shall have to get a close-up view of this admirer of yours." He did not give the matter serious thought, and neither did Madame Maigret. In the same way, they had once amused themselves for quite a while observing a courting couple who met each evening under the arches, noting their quarrels and reconciliations. Until the day when the girl who worked in the local dairy had appeared at exactly the same spot with a different young man. You know, MRA, what I've been thinking it over. I wonder whether the man couldn't be there to spy on somebody. Days passed, and the sun grew ever hotter. In the evenings, the crowd in the square became denser as all the working people from neighboring streets came to take the air beside the four fountains. What I find so strange is that he never sits down in the mornings. And why does he walk twice around the square as if he were expecting a signal? What does your pretty blonde do meanwhile? I never see her. She works in a house on the right-hand side, and from here one can't see what's happening there. I see her in the market, where she doesn't talk to anyone except to tell the tradesman what she wants. She never argues about prices, so that she's cheated of at least 20%. She always seems to have her mind on something else. Well, next time I have a tricky job of watching to be done, I'll put you onto it instead of my men. You can laugh at me, but sooner or later we shall see whether it was. 8 o'clock. MRA had dined already, which was unusual since he was generally kept rather late at the KES. He was sitting at the window in his shirt sleeves, his pipe between his lips, gazing absent-mindedly at the pink sky, which was shortly to be overrun by dusk, and at the Place Devo, now crowded with people whom the precocious summer heat had made listless. Behind him, he heard sounds which implied that Madame MRA was finishing the washing up, and would soon come to sit beside him with some piece of needlework. Evenings such as this, with no unpleasant case to solve, no murderer to discover, no thief to watch, evenings when his thoughts could roam in peace as he watched the pink sky, were rare, and MRA had never been enjoying his pipe more when suddenly, without turning round, he called out, "Henriette, do you want something? Come and look." With the stem of his pipe, he pointed to a bench just opposite. Then at one end of this bench, an old fellow who looked like A __, was taking a nap. At the other end, "It's him," declared Madame MRA. Fancy that. It struck her as almost indecent that her afternoon stroller should have disrupted his timetable, so as to be sitting on the bench at such a time. "He looks as if he'd fallen asleep," muttered Maigret, relighting his pipe. "If there weren't 2 floors to climb up afterwards, I'd go and have a closer look at your admirer so as to find out what he's really like." Madame Maigret went back into her kitchen. Maigret watched a squabble between 3 small boys who ended up by rolling in the dust, while others rushed around them on roller skates. He stayed there till he had finished his second pipe, and the stranger was still in the same place, whereas the __. "Why did you tell me he sometimes looked old and sometimes young?" "I don't know. I got that impression." "Why? How old is he?" "Under 30 at any rate." "What are you saying?" "I'm telling you that your friend is far from being what he seems. I'm telling you that he had fair hair hidden under his wig, that his mustache was a false one, and that __, had set off slowly towards the embankment." Madame Maigret settled down with some needlework in her lap, being incapable of spending an hour doing nothing. "Is he still there?" "Yes. He wore a sort of corset that gave him the stiff look of an old dandy. But there's no but about it. I'm still wondering by what miracle you happened to smell out this affair." He seemed almost to hold her responsible for what had occurred, for his spoiled evening, for the work in store for him. "Do you realize what's been going on? Well, your admirer was murdered on that bench." "You can't mean it." "In front of everybody." "Yes, in front of everybody, and probably just when there were most people about." Do you think that maid? I just sent the bullet to an expert who's going to call me in a few minutes. How could anyone have fired a revolver? Maigret shrugged his shoulders and waited for the phone call, which, as he expected, came without delay. Hello, yes, that was what I thought, but I needed your confirmation. Madame Maigret was impatient, but he deliberately kept her waiting and muttered, as though the matter did not concern her. Compressed air rifle of a special type, extremely uncommon. I don't understand. It means that the fellow was killed from a distance, possibly by someone in ambush at one of the windows around the square, who had plenty of time to take aim. He must have been a first-class marksman, moreover, for the man was shot through the heart and death was instantaneous. Thus, in broad daylight, while the crowd. Madame Maigret was so upset that she burst into tears, then apologized awkwardly. I'm sorry, I couldn't help it. I feel involved somehow. It's silly, but when you've calmed down, I'll hear your evidence. My evidence? Of course. You're the only person so far who can provide any useful information, since your curiosity led you to. And Maigret decided to give her a few details, although still apparently talking to himself. The man had no personal papers on him. His pockets were practically empty apart from a few 100-franc notes, a little small change, a tiny key, and a nail file. We shall try and identify him nonetheless. Only 30, Madame M. repeated. It was bewildering, and she understood now why she had been so strangely fascinated by the sight of this young man so rigidly maintaining the pose of an old one, like a waxwork dummy. Are you ready to answer? I'm ready. Please observe that I am questioning you in the course of my duties, and that tomorrow I shall be obliged to draw up a report of this interrogation. Madame Maigret smiled wryly, for she was somewhat awestruck. Did you notice the man today? I didn't see him in the morning because I went to the hell. In the afternoon, he was in his usual place. And the blonde girl? She was there too, as usual. Did you ever notice them speaking to one another? They'd have had to speak very loud, for they were more than 8 m apart, and they sat motionless like that all afternoon, except that the girl was doing her crochet, always crochet, for the past fortnight. Yes, you didn't notice what stitch she was using? No. If it had been knitting, I'd have known all about it. But what time did the woman go away? I don't know. I was busy preparing a custard, probably about 5 o'clock as usual, and according to the pathologist, death occurred about 5 p.m. Only now it's a matter of minutes. Did the woman leave before or after 5 o'clock? Before or after the man's death? I wonder what possessed you today of all days to make a custard. If one's going to spy on people, one may as well do it thoroughly and conscientiously. Do you believe that woman? I don't believe anything at all. I only know that I have nothing to go on for my inquiry but your information, for what it's worth. Do you know, for instance, where the blonde girl works? She always goes into number 17B. And who lives at number 17B? I don't know that either. Some people who have a big American car and a foreign-looking chauffeur. And that's all you noticed? Well, you'd make a fine detective, you can take my word for it. A big American car and a foreign-looking chauffeur. He was putting on an act, as he often did in moments of puzzlement, and his anger ended with a warm smile. Do you know, old dear, if you hadn't taken an interest in your boyfriend's behavior, I should be in a tight corner now. I don't say the situation is very promising, nor that the inquiry will be plain sailing. But all the same, we've got something to work on, however slight. The pretty blonde. The pretty blonde, as you say? That gives me an idea." He rushed to the telephone and summoned a detective, whom he stationed in front of number 17B with orders, should a handsome blonde girl come out, on no account to lose sight of her. "And now to bed. It'll be time enough tomorrow morning." He was just falling asleep when his wife ventured timidly, Don't you think it might be as well to—" "No, no, no," he shouted, half sitting up in bed. "Just because you almost showed some flair, that doesn't entitle you to start giving me advice. Anyhow, it's time to go to sleep." It was the time when the moon was touching the slate roofs of the Place de Vos with silver, while the 4 fountains kept up a sort of chamber music, in which one of them was always in a hurry and, as it were, out of tune. When Maigret, his face lathered with shaving cream and his braces dangling, cast a first glance through his window at the Place de Vos, there was already a considerable crowd of people around the seat where the night before a man had been found dead. The florist's wife, better informed than the rest since she had witnessed from afar the visit of the Department of Public Prosecution, gave wordy explanations. Even seen from a distance, her emphatic gestures showed that she was speaking with conviction. The whole neighborhood was there, and women, who a short while before had been hurrying to get to their workshop or office punctually, had suddenly found time to linger since a crime was involved. "Do you know that woman?" asked the superintendent, pointing with his razor at a youngish lady who stood out among the rest because she wore an extremely elegant light-colored suit of English cut, suitable for morning outings in the Bois de Boulogne. "I've never seen her. At least, I don't think so." That meant nothing. The first-floor apartments in the Place de Vos are inhabited by the wealthy middle class and by fashionable people. None the less, the sort of woman whom Maigret was now scrutinizing with some irritation seldom goes for a walk at 8:00 in the morning unless it be to take her dog for an airing. "Look here, this morning you must do a lot of shopping. You're to go into all the shops, you're to listen to what people are saying, and above all, you must try to get some information about the blonde maid and her employers. This time you won't call me a gossip." Madame Maigret teased him. "When do you expect to be back?" "How can I tell?" For a while, he had been asleep. The inquiry had been going on, and he hoped to find some substantial grounds for his investigation when he reached the Cour. Thus, at 11 o'clock last night, Drive E, the famous pathologist, had received a message while attending a first night at the Comédie Française in white tie and tails. He had stayed till the last act, had gone to congratulate an actress friend in her dressing room, and a quarter of an hour later, at the Forensic Institute, which is the same as the New Morgue, one of his assistants helped him to slip on his lab coat while another extracted from one of the many drawers lining the walls the body of the unknown man from the Place de Gaulle. At the same moment, on the top floor of the Petit Deux, where files hold the records of all the criminals in France and most of the criminals in the rest of the world, 2 men in gray overalls were patiently checking fingerprints. Not far from these, on the other side of a spiral staircase, the experts on dactyloscopy in the lab were beginning their meticulous study of various articles: a dark suit of old-fashioned cut, buttoned shoes, a Malacca cane with a carved ivory knob, a wig, a beret, and a tuft of fair hair cut from the dead man's head. When Maigret, after shaking hands with his colleagues and having a brief interview with his chief, went into his office, which, despite the open window, smelled of stale tobacco, 3 reports were awaiting him, tidily set out on his desk in folders of different colors. Dr. Harrod's report first. The victim had died almost immediately on being hit, and the shot had been fired from a distance of over 20 meters, possibly as much as 100, with a small caliber gun, which nonetheless gave its missiles great penetrative force. Probable age, 28. In view of the absence of professional marks, it was probable that the man had never engaged continuously in manual work. On the other hand, he had practiced sport, particularly rowing and boxing. He was in perfect health and particularly robust. A scar on the left shoulder showed that about 3 years previously the young man had been wounded by a revolver bullet which had struck his shoulder blade. Finally, a certain compression of the fingertips suggested that he must have done a considerable amount of typing. Maigret read all this slowly, puffing at his pipe and looking up from time to time to watch the S flow past in the dazzling morning sunlight. At other moments, he would scribble a word or two, comprehensible only to himself, in the notebook which was notorious not only for its ordinariness but because, during long years of use, it had accumulated comments bewilderingly superimposed on one another in all directions. The laboratory report was scarcely more sensational. The garments had been worn by others before belonging to their recent owner, and everything implied that he had bought them in some junk shop or in the Carreau diem. The walking stick and the button shoes seemed to have come from the same source. The wig, which was of fairly good quality, was of a very ordinary type such as can be found at any wig-maker's. Finally, the examination of the dust found in the garments disclosed a largish quantity of very fine flour, not purified but still mingled with fragments of brown. The pebs were of plain glass, useless as an aid to sight. There was nothing in the records, no card bearing fingerprints corresponding to those of the victim. Maigret sat for a few minutes with his elbows on his desk, lost in thought, and possibly overcome by some degree of lethargy. The case promised neither well nor badly, rather badly on the whole, however, since there had been no help at all from chance, which was usually fairly generous. Finally, he rose, put on his hat, and spoke to the janitor on duty in the corridor. "If anyone wants me, I shall be back in about an hour." He was too close to the Place Divo to take a taxi, and he went there on foot. Along the Seine at the F shop in the Rue Toel, who caught sight of Madame Maigret in animated conversation with 3 or 4 gossiping housewives, he averted his head to conceal a smile and went on his way. During Maigret's early days in the police force, one of his bosses, who had a passion for the scientific methods which had recently been introduced, used to tell him, "Careful, young man, not so much imagination. Police work is not done with ideas but with facts." This, however, had not prevented Maigret from going on in his own way and carving out a pretty successful career for himself. Thus, as he reached the Place d'Aiguille, he was worrying less about the technical details contained in that morning's reports than about what he would have called the atmosphere of the crime. He tried to imagine the victim not dead, as he had seen him, but alive. A young fellow of 28, fair-haired, strong and muscular, probably elegant, dressing up every morning in that old dandy's outfit bought at some second-hand market stall and under which he still wore fine linen, and walking twice around the square before disappearing along the Rue de Turin. Where did he go? What did he do until 3 o'clock in the afternoon? Did he still look like a character from some 19th century comedy, or did he change clothes somewhere in the neighborhood? How could he then stay motionless for 3 hours on end, never opening his mouth, never making a gesture, just staring into space? How long had this performance been going on? Finally, at night, where did the stranger disappear to? What was his private life? Whom did he see? Whom did he speak to? To whom did he confide the secret of his personality? How was one to account for the flour and the fragments of bran in his clothing, which suggested a mill rather than a bakery? What could he have been doing in a mill? All this made Maigret forget to stop at number 17B, and he had to retrace his steps. He went in under the archway and spoke to the concierge. She showed no surprise when he showed her his police badge. "What is it you want?" "I'd like to know which of your tenants employs a rather pretty, smart, fair-haired maid." She interrupted him to say, without the least hesitation, "Mademoiselle Rita Mady. Every afternoon, she looks after 2 children in the square. They're her employer's children, Monsieur and Madame Crofter, who have had the first-floor flat for well over 15 years. They were here even before me. Miss Crofter runs an import and export business. He has an office somewhere in the Rue du Septembre. Is he at home? He's just gone out, but Madame must be upstairs. And Rita? I don't know. I haven't seen her yet this morning. Actually, I've been doing the stairs." A few minutes later, Maigret rang at the door of the first-floor flat, and although he could hear noises going on in the depths of the apartment, he was kept waiting for quite a while at the door. He rang again. Finally, the door was half opened, and Maigret saw a youngish woman trying to disguise her state of undress beneath a pale blue housecoat. "What do you want?" "To speak to Monsieur or Madame Crofter. I'm a superintendent of the police judiciary." She let him in resignedly, folding her housecoat about her, and Maigret found himself in a splendid apartment with large, high rooms furnished with great taste and displaying valuable bibelots. "I apologize for receiving you like this, but I'm alone with the children. How can you have got here so soon?" "My husband only left a quarter of an hour ago." She was a foreigner, as was clear from her slight accent and from her typically Central European charm. Maigret had already recognized her as the woman he had noticed that morning wearing a light-colored suit and listening to the housewives gossiping in the middle of the Place d'Aigues. "Were you expecting me?" he said quietly, trying to conceal his surprise. "You or somebody else? But I must confess I didn't know the police acted so swiftly. I suppose my husband will be back soon." "I don't know. Haven't you seen him?" "No, but then there was obviously some misunderstanding." And Maigret, who hoped to gain some information thereby, did nothing to clear it up. The young woman, meanwhile, possibly in order to give herself time to think, stammered out, "Will you excuse me a moment? The children are in the bathroom, and I wonder if they're not up to some mischief." She moved smoothly away. She had real beauty, both of face and figure, with a certain majesty in addition to her supple grace. She could be heard exchanging a few words with her children in the bathroom. Then she came back with a slight smile of welcome. "Forgive me, I never even asked you to sit down. I'd rather my husband had been here, for he knows more than I do about the value of the jewels, since it was he who bought them." To what jewels was she referring? And what was it all about? And why did the young woman appear so tense as she impatiently awaited her husband's return? It looked as though she were afraid of talking, and was trying to drag out the conversation without giving anything away. Maigret, who was conscious of all this, was careful not to give her any help. He looked at her with the utmost detachment, assuming what he called his plain man's expression. "One's constantly reading about thefts in the papers, but oddly enough, one never imagined such things happening to one." And yesterday evening I had no suspicion. It was this morning when you came in again? MRA suggested. She gave a start. How do you know I'd been out? Because I saw you. You were in the neighborhood already. I'm here all the year round, for I'm one of your neighbors. She was disturbed at this. She was clearly wondering what this mysteriously simple remark might imply. I went out, true, as I often do, to take the air before getting the children dressed. That's why you find me in deshabille. When I came back, I put on my housecoat, and she could not restrain a sigh of relief. Footsteps had halted on the landing. A key turned in the door. "It's my husband," she murmured, and she called out, "Boris, come in here. There's somebody waiting for you." The man was good-looking, too, older than his wife, about 45 years of age, well-dressed and well-groomed. A Hungarian or a Czech, MRA thought, but speaking perfect, polished French. "The superintendent has got here before you, and I was telling him you'd soon be back." Boris Crofter was scrutinizing MCRA with polite attention, which did not wholly disguise mistrust. "I beg your pardon," he murmured, "but I don't quite understand. Superintendent Maigret of the Police Judiciaire. It's odd. You wish to speak to me, the employer of a girl called Rita, who looked after 2 children in the Place d'Eve every afternoon?" "Yes, but you're not going to tell me that you've already traced her, or that you've recovered the jewelry. I know I must strike you as peculiar. The coincidence is so strange that I'm trying to understand it. You must realize that I've just got back from the local police station, where I went to lodge a complaint against her. On my return, I find you here, and you tell me, what was the subject of your complaint? The theft of the jewelry. The girl disappeared yesterday without warning. I thought she must have run off with a young man, and I decided to put an advertisement in the newspaper last night. We never left the house this morning. While my wife was out, it suddenly occurred to me to look in her jewel case. That was when I understood why Rita had run away, for the jewel case was empty." "What time was it when you made this discovery?" "Barely 9 o'clock in the morning. I was in my dressing gown. I dressed quickly and hurried off to the police station." "And at this point, your wife came back?" "That's right, while I was dressing. What I still fail to understand is your coming here this morning." "Just a coincidence," MRA murmured in a tone of the utmost innocence. "And yet, I'd like to be in the picture. Did you know this morning?" "Wife just told me it was she who had gone up." "That's true, but I went up myself afterwards." The open door disclosed a maid's bedroom, which would have been quite unremarkable with its iron bed, its wardrobe, and washstand, but for the view over the Place d'Ege to be seen through the window beside the wardrobe. There was a fiber suitcase of a familiar type. Inside the wardrobe, some clothes and underwear. "So your maid must have gone off without any luggage. I suppose she chose to take the jewelry instead. It was worth about 200,000 FRS. MCG's big fingers were fiddling with a small green hat. Then he picked up another, trimmed with a yellow ribbon. "Can you tell me how many hats your maid had?" "I no idea. My wife may perhaps be able to tell you, but I doubt it." "How long had she been in your service?" 6 months. "Did you find her through an advertisement?" "Through an employment agency, which had warmly recommended her. For that matter, she was an excellent servant." "You have no other staff?" "My wife likes to look after the children herself, so that one maid is quite enough for us, particularly as we spend a good part of the year on the Riviera, where we have a gardener and his wife to help in the house." Maigret suddenly felt impelled to blow his nose in spite of the weather. He dropped his handkerchief and bent down to pick it up. "That's odd," he muttered as he stood up again. Then, looking his companion up and down, he opened his mouth and closed it again. "Did you want to say something?" "I wanted to ask you one more question, but it's so indiscreet that you may think it uncalled for." "Please go on if you insist." "Well, I wanted to ask you on the off chance whether your maid, being such a pretty girl, you had ever had any relations with her other than those between an employer and his servant. I'm asking you this off the record, and you're quite entitled not to reply." Oddly enough, Crofter seemed to ponder suddenly much more preoccupied than he had been. He took his time before replying. He cast a slow glance all around him, and then said with a sigh, "Must my reply become official? In all probability, there will be no question of that. In that case, I'd rather admit to you that in fact I have occasionally, in the rooms on the first floor." "No, that would be difficult because of the children." "Did you meet outside the house?" "No, never. I came up here from time to time, and I understand the rest," Maigret said with a smile. "And I'm very glad to have your answer. Actually, I had noticed that a button was missing from the sleeve of your jacket, and I've just picked up that button on the floor at the foot of the bed. Obviously, some violent exertion must have been needed to wrench it off." And he handed the button to his companion, who seized it with surprising eagerness. "When was the last time this happened?" Maigret asked casually as he went towards the door. 3 or 4 days ago. Wait a minute. 4 days, yes." "And Rita was willing?" "I think so." "Was she in love with you?" "At any rate, she let me think she was." "Have you any rival that you know of?" "Oh, Superintendent, there was no question of that. And if Rita had had a lover, I'd certainly not have considered him as a rival. I adore my wife and my children, and I don't know myself why I—" And Maigret, as he went down the stairs, said to himself with a sigh, "Well, my fine fellow, I have the impression that you've not been telling the truth for a single moment." He stopped in the concierge's lodge and sat down opposite the woman who was shelling peas. "So you've been to see them there?" "No end upset about that jewelry business." "Were you in your lodge yesterday at 5 o'clock?" "To be sure I was, and my son was sitting just where you are now, doing his homework." "Did you see her and the children come in?" "As clear as I see you now." "And did you see her come down again?" "A few minutes later. That's what Miss Crofter came to ask me just now." I told him I hadn't seen anything. He insists that's not possible, that I must have gone out of the lodge or that I wasn't paying attention. After all, so many people go past. Yet I think I'd have noticed her, seeing as it wasn't her usual time of day. Have you ever met Miss Crofter going up to the 3rd floor? What would he have gone up there for? Oh, I understand. You think perhaps he'd have gone up to be with the maid. You obviously don't know Miss Rita. They're saying now that she was a thief. That's as may be, but she wasn't one for gaddying about or letting her master have his way with her. Maigret resignedly lit his pipe and moved off. "Well then, Madam Superintendent Maigret," he teased her affectionately as he sat down by the window, his shirt sleeves gleaming in the sunlight. "Well, for lunch today you'll have to make do with some grilled steak and an artichoke, and I bought that ready-cooked to save time. According to gossip, what do they say? Come on, give us the results of your inquiry." "For one thing, Mademoiselle Rita wasn't really a servant." "How do you know?" "All the tradespeople noticed that she didn't know how to count in sous, which implies that she's never had to do the shopping. The first time the butcher tried to give her change for a franc, she stared at him, and if she accepted it, I'm sure it was in order not to call attention to herself. Good. So she was a young lady playing maid at the Crofters? I think rather she was a student. In the local shops, they talk all sorts of languages: Italian, Hungarian, Polish. Apparently, she always seemed to understand, and when jokes were made in her presence, she used to smile. And hadn't they anything to say about your admirer? Some people had noticed him, but not to the same extent that I had. Oh yes, there's something else, the gas dam. Bid's maid, who often goes to sit in the square of an afternoon, declares that Rita didn't know how to crochet, and that it would have been impossible to use the things she made except for floor cloths. Maigret's narrowed eyes were twinkling with amusement at the care which his wife had taken to put together her recollections and express them in an orderly and methodical way. That's not all. Before Rita, the Crofters had a maid of their own nationality, but they dismissed her because she became pregnant by a Crofter. Oh no, he's too much in love with his wife. Apparently, he's so jealous that they don't entertain anybody. Thus, all this petty gossip, these assertions which might be true or untrue, sincere or otherwise, help to alter and sometimes to complete me. Georges' picture of the people concerned. Since you've done such good work, Maigret murmured as he lit a fresh pipe, I'm going to give you a hint. Myself, the shot that killed our unknown friend in the wig and pens was fired from Rita's attic window, as can easily be proved in a reconstruction of the crime. I checked the angle of fire, which corresponds absolutely with the position of the body and the trajectory of the bullet. Do you believe it was she who? I've no idea. Think it over yourself. And with a sigh, he resumed his tie. She helped him into his jacket. Half an hour later, he sank into his chair at police headquarters and mopped his face, for it was even hotter than on the previous day, and there was thunder in the air. An hour later, MCG's 3 pipes were warm, the ashtray was overflowing, and the blotter was covered with a tangle of words and scraps of sentences scrawled in all directions. As for the superintendent, he was yawning, patently drowsy, and staring round-eyed at what he had written in the course of his why. Supposing the Crofter had got rid of Rita, the theft of jewelry was a clever invention to divert suspicion from himself. It was a nice idea, but there was no proof of it, and the maid might well have run off with her employer's jewels. Crofter had hesitated before admitting that he had made love with his servant. That might mean that it was true, and that he was embarrassed by it. It could equally well mean that it was not true, but that he had seen him, Gray, picking up the button, or that he suspected the superintendent's question of concealing a trap of this sort. Could the button have been left for 4 days on the floor, which seemed to have been recently swept? And why had Madame Crofter been for an early morning walk today? Why had she seemed reluctant to admit that she had heard people talking about the crime when Maigret had seen her spend a considerable time listening to the gossiping housewives? Why had Crofter asked the concierge if she had seen Rita go out? Was he conducting a personal investigation? Wasn't it more likely that he knew the police would ask the same question, and that by speaking of it beforehand, he had the chance of influencing the good woman by suggestion? Suddenly Maigret sprang up. The final result of this accumulation of trivial facts and observations was not merely to irritate him, but to arouse a secret anxiety in him, for it led inevitably to the question, Where was Rita? She was on the run if she was guilty of theft and murder. But if she was guilty of neither, then, a minute later, he was in the chief's office, where, putting on his surliest air, he demanded, "Did you let me have a blank search warrant? Things not going right?" The head of the police judiciary chaffed him. He was more familiar than most people with Maigret's moods. "We'll try and get it for you, but you'll have to be prudent, eh?" As it happened, while the chief was seeing about the search warrant, Maigret was summoned to the telephone. It was his wife, and there was acute anxiety in her voice. "I've just thought of something. I don't know if I ought to say it over the telephone. Say it anyway. Supposing it wasn't the person you're thinking of who fired the shot. I understand. Carry on. Supposing, for instance, it was her employer. You follow me? I wonder if by any chance she could still be in the house, dead perhaps, or else a prisoner." It was touching to see Madame Maigret eagerly following a trail for the first time in her life. But what the superintendent would not admit was that she had practically reached the same point as himself. However, he queried ironically, "Is that all? You're making fun of me. You don't believe that. In short, you imagine that by searching number 17B from cellar to attic, just think, suppose she was still alive. We'll see. Meanwhile, let's hope dinner will be a bit more substantial than lunch." He hung up and went back to the chief's room for the warrant he needed. "Doesn't this case suggest espionage to you, Maigret?" The superintendent, who hated committing himself in such cases, merely shrugged his shoulders. But as soon as he had left the room, he retraced his steps and called out briefly, "I'll answer that question tonight." Madame Luer, the concierge of number 17B, was no doubt a worthy woman who did her best to bring up her children decently, but she had one terrible fault. She panicked readily. "You understand," she admitted. "With all these people asking me questions from first thing this morning, I don't know if I'm coming or going." "Keep calm, Madame Luer," said Maigret as he sat by the window, not far from the small boy who was doing his homework as on the previous day. "I've never done any harm to anyone. And you're not being accused of doing any harm to anyone. You're only being asked to try and remember. How many tenants have you?" 22, because I must tell you that the flats on the second and third floors are very small, just 1 or 2 rooms, so that we have a lot of people. "Did any of these tenants have anything to do with the Crafters?" "How could they? The Crafters are rich people with their own car and a chauffeur. By the way, do you know where they garage their car?" "Somewhere along the boulevard. H. 4. The chauffeur hardly ever comes here, for he has his meals out." "Did he come yesterday afternoon?" "I can't remember. I believe he did." "With the car?" "No, the car wasn't parked here yesterday nor this morning. It's true that the crofter hardly went out. Let's see, was the chauffeur in the house yesterday at about 5 o'clock? No, he left again at 4:30. I remember because my boy had just come back from school." "That's true," confirmed the boy, looking up. "Now another question. Have any large cases been taken out of the house since 5 o'clock yesterday? For instance, has a removal van been parked in the neighborhood?" "No, I'm sure of that. Nobody has taken out any cupboards or chests or unwieldy packages." "What do you expect me to say?" she moaned. "How can I tell what you mean by an unwieldy package? One that might, for instance, contain a human body." "Good heavens! Is that what you're thinking of? Are you supposing now that somebody's been murdered in my house?" Go back over your recollections hour by hour. No, I saw nothing of the sort. No lorry, no cart, not even a hand cart came into the courtyard. I've told you so. There's no empty room in the house. All the flats are occupied, all without exception. There was just one room on the third floor, and that's been let for the past 2 months. At that point, the boy raised his head and, with his pen between his lips, mumbled, "What about the piano, Mom? What can that have to do with it? That wasn't a case being taken out. It was a case being brought in, and they had a hard job getting it up the stairs. A piano was delivered here yesterday at 6:30. What firm? I don't know. There was no name on the van. This one didn't come into the courtyard. There was a great big case, and 3 men were at it for a good hour. Did they take the case away with them? No. Lucian went down, with the workmen to stand them a drink at the bistro around the corner. Who is this? Lucian, the tenant of the little room I was telling you about. He's been there 2 months. He's very quiet and respectable. They say he writes music. Does he know the Crofters? I shouldn't think he's even seen them. Was he at home at 5 o'clock yesterday? He came at about 4:30, about the time the chauffeur left. Did he tell you then that he was expecting a piano? No, he simply asked if there were any letters for him. Did he usually get many? Very few. Many thanks, madam. Try to keep calm. There's no need for you to worry yourself. R.A. went out and gave instructions to 2 inspectors who were pacing up and down in the Place Deguet. Then he returned to number 17B, going quickly past the lodge lest the concierge should start questioning him again and confiding all her anxiety. R.A. did not stop on the first floor nor on the second. On the third, bending down, he noticed the scratches made by the piano as the men dragged it along. It seemed to him that the scratches stopped at the 4th door, and he knocked at it. He heard shuffling footsteps like those of an old woman in slippers. Then a cautious voice mumbled, "Who's there?" Lucian, please. It's next door." But at the same moment, another voice muttered a few words, and the door was partially opened. A stout old woman tried to make out R.A.'s features in the half-darkness. "Monsieur Lucian isn't in just now. Can I take a message for him?" R.A. instinctively leaned forward to try and see the second person who was in the room. In the dim light, it was difficult to make out anything. The room was cluttered with old furniture, old fabrics, hideous trinkets, and pervaded by the peculiar smell of places where old people live. Beside the sewing machine, a woman was sitting upright as though on a formal call, and the superintendent was more surprised than he had ever been in his life when he recognized his own wife. "I heard that Mademoiselle Austen undertook little sewing jobs," Madame Emery hurriedly explained. "I came to see her about this." We chatted. "Her room happens to be next door to the maid's room, the girl who stole." Emery gave a shrug, wondering what his wife was getting at. "The oddest thing is that yesterday they brought up a piano for the neighbor on the other side in a huge case, which must still be there." This time Maigret frowned, enraged that his wife should, heaven knows how, have reached the same conclusions as himself. "Since Lucian isn't here, I shall have to go downstairs," he announced, and he did not waste a minute. The 2 inspectors whom he had left in the Place Deguet in front of the house were now posted in the stairway, not far from the Crofters' door. A locksmith was sent for, and also the local police superintendent. The result was that shortly afterwards the door of Muir Lucian's room had been forced open. In the room there was merely a very ordinary piano, a bed, a chair, a wardrobe, and standing against the wall, the case which had contained the piano. "Get this case opened," ordered Maigret, who was playing high and was intensely nervous. He did not want to touch the case himself for fear of finding it empty. He filled his pipe with assumed calm and pretended to be quite unmoved when he heard a shout. "Superintendent, there's a woman here." "I know she's alive. I know," he repeated. Of course, if there was a woman in the packing case, it must be the notorious Rear, and he was practically certain she must be alive, tightly bound and gagged. "Try to bring her around. Send for a doctor." He walked past his wife, who was in the corridor with Mademoiselle Austen, and who gave him a smile unparalleled in their domestic history, a smile which suggested that Madame Maigret might be going to exchange her role of docile spouse for that of detective. As the superintendent reached the first floor, the door of the Crofter apartment opened. Crofter was there in person, in a state of considerable excitement, yet wholly master of himself. "Is Miss Maigret there?" he asked the two detectives on sentry duty. "Here I am, Mr. Crofter. You're wanted on the telephone. It's the Ministry of the Interior." Actually, it was the director of the police judiciary calling his subordinate. "Is that you, Maigret? I thought I might catch you here while you were up to heaven knows what elsewhere in the house. The person in whose apartment you're now taking this call got in touch with his embassy. They contacted the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who, I understand," growled Maigret, "just as I told you, a case of espionage. Our orders are to keep mum, to avoid any leakage to the press. Crofter has been, for a long time now, his country's unofficial agent in France. He centralizes the reports of secret agents." Crofter, the man in question, was standing in a corner of the room, pale but smiling. "May I offer you something, Superintendent?" "No, thanks." "I understand you have found my servant?" And the superintendent replied, stressing each syllable, "I found her just in time." "Yes, Miss Crofter. Good day to you." "I was sure," Madame Maigret said, as she finished making her chocolate custard, "when I heard that the girl didn't know how to crochet." Of course, her husband agreed. They must really have managed to tell each other some interesting things by this system, spending several hours a day at it. If I understand it right, this girl Rita, who had taken a post as a domestic servant with the Crofters, actually spent her time spying on her employers. Maigret was never fond of explaining his cases, but under the circumstances, it would have been too cruel to leave Madame Maigret in the dark. "She spied on spies," he growled, and he added sullenly, shrugging his shoulders, "That's why, just as I was about to pounce on the gang at last, I got the order, 'Give it up.' Silence and discretion." "Indeed, that can't be very pleasant," she sighed, as though she thus excused all Maigret's past ill humor. It was a pretty case, though, with strokes of genius. Try to understand the situation. On the one hand, the Croft, with all the information that passes through their hands, and which they transmit to their own government. On the other hand, the maid, Rear, and a man, the old gentleman on the bench, your mysterious admirer. For whom were they working? That doesn't concern me now. It's up to intelligence. They were probably the agents of another power, or perhaps of a dissident faction, since the internal and external policies of certain countries are peculiarly mixed up. The fact remains that they needed the information centralized every day by Crofter, and Rita got hold of this without too much difficulty. But how could it be passed on outside? Spies are very vigilant, and any suspicious behavior on her part would have ruined her. And so they hit on the idea of the old dandy on the bench and the idea of the crochet hook, which, used by hands more expert than they seemed, might communicate by its jerky movements long messages in Morse code. Sitting opposite Rita, her accomplice recorded everything in his memory. It's just one more example of the incredible patience of certain secret agents, for he had to retain everything he had learned word for hours on end until the time when, back in his home at Corbett near Moulin, he would spend the night typing it out. I wonder how the Crofters discovered this extremely cunning device. They probably learned of it through the chauffeur when he came in at about 4 o'clock. Madame Craw was so afraid of his stopping that she listened without daring to display the least sign of emotion. Now you know as much as I do. The Crofters had to do away with the man first and next to question Rita to get her to say for whom she was working, and how much she had already given away for some time past. C. Crofter has been housing a killer, Muir Lucian, who's a first-class shot. He rings him up, and Lucian wastes no time. From the girl's bedroom, he shoots down his allotted victim. Nobody has seen or heard anything except Rita, who has to take the children home and is forced to keep up a pretense of ignorance on pain of being shot down in her turn. She knows what to expect. They try to keep her seat secret from her. She holds out. They threaten her with death, and they have that piano brought up to him, Lucian's room, so that the case can be used to remove her body. Besides, who would think of looking for her in the musician's room? Crofter has already planned his defensive strategy. He lodges a complaint, reports his maid's disappearance, invents the theft of the jewels, and a pause. Night was falling. The blue of the sky was darkening, and the silvery sound of the fountains harmonized with the liquid silver of the moonlight. And you coped with it, Madame Maigret suddenly said with admiration. He looked at her, half seriously, half smiling. She went on, "How maddening that at the crucial moment they prevented you from finishing the job." Then he said with mock indignation, "Do you know what's even more maddening? To have found you at that Mademoiselle Augustine's, for after all, you got there before me. But then, of course, the victim was your admirer."